Okay, welcome students. Welcome to chapter 2 and 3, the Constitution and Federalism. In these chapters, so it's 2 and 3, we're going to be learning about the Constitution, what came about to, why do we have the Constitution that we have today, and what brought this about, and then what federalism is. Why do we have the form of government where we have a central government, a strong federal government in Washington, D.C., but we also have an equally strong state government in Sacramento, as well as our local governments. May you live in Ontario, Ventura, uh, Northridge, Los Angeles, San Bernardino, wherever you live, you have a local government, city government, but you also have a county government based on which county you're in. So LA County has a county board of supervisors, as well as San Bernardino and San Diego. And so even if you're up in Northern California, up in Alameda, where Oakland sits, or just where you Sacramento, where Sacramento sits. Every city sits within a county, and so these are what we call separation of powers. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get ready to head on into the lecture, and we will go over some of the terminology, the history behind why we became the nation that we became. So I look forward to sharing the information and my knowledge with you. Okay, have a great time. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the beginnings of American government. When America was first discovered, I hate to use the term discovered because this nation was not discovered, right? It's really a nation that was, there were people who were already here, but it was discovered for the Europeans, and the part we're going to talk about are the British settlements, because let's remember now, the Spanish and the Portuguese had already been in America. They had the only reason why the English and the French came because the Spanish had found gold, and they came here looking for the same thing, right? They wanted to increase their treasury. So what we're going to do now is go over some of the terminology and what it means, why we have this nation that we have today. In the beginning, we had the Plymouth Colony. The Plymouth Colony was a colony that was founded by the Plymouth Company. So what really happened in the early stages of the colonies was that there were companies called like the Plymouth Company, and the companies would pay captains and sailors to go to the New World and take settlers to go settle land. The Plymouth Colony was the first New England colony. It was founded by the Plymouth Company in 1620. What is today Massachusetts. Most of the settlers of Plymouth were pilgrims. These were a group of English Protestants who came to the New World on the Mayflower. We all learned about the Mayflower when we were kids. And so when they got here, they did a compact, which is a social contract, right? Called the Mayflower Compact. Basically, what the Mayflower Compact was a set of laws where they were to be made for the general good of the people. So it was this idea that we set up laws, everybody abides, and we all agree to follow these laws. We do this today. We have a set of laws that we abide by, right? Now, when we break these laws, there will be punishments for breaking the laws. There will be consequences, right? And so, the Mayflower Compact was one of the first ones for those who settled in what was present day the Plymouth Colony, which was in Massachusetts. You also had other type of compacts, these agreements. We have a set of laws. Everybody will abide by them. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, where you had these early establishments of not just even laws, but even like little town councils, legislators who made America, who made the settlements and told people, look, we have a set of rules. You will abide by the rules, and if you break the rules, there will be some kind of punishment for you breaking those rules. In Pennsylvania, they had the Pennsylvania frame of government, where you set up a government, and with this government came a charter of privileges. These are the privileges. As long as you follow the law, you're fine to settle here and to live a life that is as a good citizen. Basically, are you're being a good citizen? Um, the next thing to come with the early Americans was the Bill of Rights. Now, where did we get the Bill of Rights? Well, the early Americans got the Bill of Rights from the English. It was called the English Bill of Rights, right? And so, if you notice, we're not very original. We just take off the English part and it just becomes the Bill of Rights. And what are the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Those amendments are the amendments where it says what things government can't do. Okay, so there's certain things government can't do, like they can't stop you from congregating, they can't stop you from voicing your opinion. Now there's limitations on the things you can say and do, right? There's limitations. You can't go into the airport and yell bomb. You can't go into a crowded movie theater and yell fire. So there are limitations, but for the most part, there you can go to wherever place of worship if you choose to go to a place of worship. You don't have to go to a place of worship, right? We don't have a national religion, and so which makes America really not a Christian nation. Now our nation's built on Christian principles, but really by and large, officially, we're not a Christian nation. And there's a on page 27 of your textbook, there is a little article called "Was the United States Meant to Be a Christian Nation?" I think it's a great little uh, article, article about on debate. It's like, what do you think, right? And so, is America a Christian nation? So that's very interesting, and I'll let you guys worry about that. Let you guys read that for yourselves. But let's back to the first 10 amendments. Also, it says you have a right to bear arms, right? So this idea that people can have arms to protect their property. Right. Lately, we've been having a lot of issues with guns, and the issues are not just about guns, but it's also about mental health. Right. So we're talking about, and can we have that discussion? Can we talk about uh, uh, regulating what type of guns we have on our streets, but also deal with mental health in our community, especially in communities. And what I mean by community, I mean by America as a society with men. Because if you think about it, most mass shootings are done by males. So that tells me there's probably we need to do more research into our society and males and what's going on with men with mass shootings. But also in the ten amendments talks about other things like your right to a trial, a speedy trial, and so on and so forth. So when you read the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, it really does tell you what government can and cannot do. What government really can't do, it protects you, right? And that's why you have Bill of Rights. Those we call your civil liberties. Those are your civil liberties. Next up is, well, again, I kind of touched on this, your freedom of speech and press and religion. That is citizen enjoys. You don't have to go to church. Government cannot infringe upon your rights. You do have rights. Now, I hear students tell me all the time, but professor, this police officer walked up to me and started saying all these things like, give me this. And, they wanted to come in my house and look around for things. Well, if they don't have a warrant, they can't come in. And if you don't know your rights, anybody will do what they can do to, let's just be honest, pull a fast one. So it's your job, it's your duty to know your rights, both federally and state-wise, right? Because there are certain laws we have in California that don't affect people in Arizona, and so on and so forth. One thing you can't do in California is videotape people. You just can't go and just go around videotaping people. There's a TV show called What Would You Do with John Quinones on ABC, and he goes to different places. If you notice, whenever he does what would you do in a certain situation, it's always New Jersey, New York, Texas. And I actually contacted him once. I said, well, how come you guys don't come to California? He said, John Quinones replied back to me and said, because the laws in California don't allow us to videotape people. So it's a little harder here to do those type of what would you do scenarios. When we go to the next slide, this is a picture of a 13 colonies. This is what the early America looked like. Massachusetts, if you look at Massachusetts, it was both Maine and what became present day Maine and Massachusetts. Maine would not become a state till later. But you notice there's Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. You also notice there's no Vermont. So these are your original colonies here. And you would see Vermont and Maine become independent states, independent of the states that they were a part of. Also, in the beginning, New Jersey was really a part of Pennsylvania, but then New Jersey becomes its own first colony, then its own state. What changes? Well, there's rebellion of the colonists, taxation without representation, and we hear this a lot. We all hear this. Americans don't like being taxed. We just don't. And the early Americans, this is why, because the early Americans, this is in our bloodstream. We think that we as a society don't like the idea of government in our business. We don't want government charging us for things. We get upset, especially when you don't feel like you're being represented at the top echelons of our government. So one of the things that caused this upheaval was the Stamp Act of 1765. Now, the Stamp Act of 1765, when Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which imposed the first direct tax on the colonists, this made them kind of unhappy. Now, under the Act, all legal documents and newspapers had to use specially embossed, that means a stamp, like you have to stamp it, you know, like notary public. This is kind of like what notary publics do, right? And so you're charging people to do certain things for items such as playing cards and dice were also subject to this requirement. So even to gamble back then or play games, there had to be a document of a stamp, and so they were stamping everything, and this did not make the colonists very happy. Right, and again, remember this is the first direct tax of the colonists. The colonists resisted because, again, when you feel like when you're being taxed for something, and especially think about it, the colonists were in the New World, which was the Americas, and if you remember, London is kind of far away, and these people, these men and women, these men, not women, these men in London were making rules that had an effect on people who were across the ocean in the New World. Well, the people in the New World didn't have any rights. They weren't in London in Parliament, defending themselves and asking, well, how do we benefit from all these taxes that are coming back to London? Again, the early colonists pushed back because they weren't represented in British Parliament. They didn't like the idea of being across the ocean. In 1767, Britain passed laws that imposed new taxes. So not only were they being taxed for a stamp, but now you had new forms of taxes. This is where the Boston Tea Party tends to happen, right? The people push the tea into the Boston Harbor. The British ends up trying to starve the people in Boston by putting a blockade on Boston Harbor because as retribution for the Boston Tea Party. You will have these coercive acts along, taxes on glass, paint, lead, and many other items that were being sold in the New World. And this was a bit of a problem for the colonists. They didn't like the idea that, hey, we have rights too. And we see this today. Again, we as Americans push back on this idea that if I'm not being represented, why are you taxing me? And we do this all the time. The only thing about what we don't realize what our taxes do, taxes tend to pay for things like 911, right? The mail being delivered to your house. Just imagine things like UPS and FedEx and DHL don't have the infrastructure to deliver mail like the U.S. Postal Service. And so those are certain things where we help pay for. The roadways are important. If our roads are not paved and kept up, then it's not good on our tires, on the alignment. Then you have to have the car balanced, and this stuff adds up. So this is some. So sometimes taxes are really good for us as a society because it's good for our cars. It's good for the fact that it's. I would rather. Would you rather pay an extra 10 cents on gas, or would you rather pay 1,500 once a year, twice a year on tires and alignments and balancing your car and so on and so forth. So when we think of taxes, taxes have far-reaching effects on our lives, and so I think sometimes we need to, unlike the colonists, we need to dig a little deeper and find out where is this money going, why are we being taxed, and so on and so forth. Um, what ends up happening with the colonists, like it does with everybody, colonists protested by boycotting all British goods. The colonists, even now, imagine now, remember the Boston Tea Party? This idea, we live in a time where when we see people protesting, or which some people call it protesting, other people call it rioting, whatever you call it, the forefathers, the colonists did it. That's exactly what the colonists, it's called the Boston Tea Party. So whenever I hear people say, well, they're destroying property, that's literally what the forefathers did. They destroyed property because you destroy things to get people's attention. Now, is it right? I'm not here to argue if burning buildings down and throwing tea into the Boston Harbor is right or wrong, but it does get people's attention. And so I think sometimes we tend to live in a world where we try to, be like, why are they doing this? They shouldn't do that. Well, really, kind of they should, because that's what the colonists did. That's exactly what was going on when we fought for our independence as a nation. You have the rebellion of the colonists. So then the colonists ends up rebelling, and one of the things they did when they rebelled was the first Continental Congress. You had a gathering of delegates from the 12 of the 13 colonies because Georgia decided to sit this one out. And the Congress decided that the colonists should send a petition to King George III to explain their grievances. These are our concerns. What ends up happening, I think, well, what's up happening is George ignores the colonists. He doesn't look. He's a king, and does the king care what his subjects thinks? We tend to it's almost like a parent with a child. I'm not going to listen to what you have to say because I'm the parent. I know what's best for you and what's best. And really, again, was it best for the colonists? Probably not, but it was best for his treasury, especially when the English were spending so much time fighting the French. In 1774, there was protest of the Coercive Acts. Because you have the protest of the Coercive Acts, you end up having the Second Continental Congress. When the Second Continental Congress gathers, this time all 13 gather in Pennsylvania, which during the Second Continental Congress they assume the powers of a central government. So the Second Continental Congress really begins the drive for independence, right? And when you're fighting for independence, and you assume the powers of a central government, what you're telling London is you're no longer in charge. You no longer have control. And so, therefore, because you no longer have control, you're no longer in charge. We are now assuming that authority. Well, as we learn later, the English don't take that too kindly because first of all they're fighting wars in Europe and they're fighting pretty much around the world as they knew it then against the French, and so they kind of need the money and to because around this time within the next 10 to 20 years you have the rise of Napoleon, and so then the British are fighting the French in all pretty much all throughout Europe and the rest of the world. So again, as like I was saying, the you see the colonists assume the powers of the central government. Ends up taking away from the British, away from the king, and not just George II, but you have a prime minister, and like I said, they need this money to basically fight the French because the British and the French fought many wars and that they were literally enemies before you see World War One and Two, where the British and French stand side by side with each other. What the Congress ends up doing was they established an army. They needed to have an army to be prepared to fight this war of independence from the British. Now, when this idea of gaining independence, breaking away from the England, one of the ways to always get people on board is to use propaganda, and best way to use propaganda in our world is through media. Nowadays, we have Fox News, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have many different ways to get people to join our cause, and sometimes we don't always tell the truth. But back in this day was the earliest form of using media to get people in favor on board was Thomas Paine. He was a former English schoolmaster and corset maker who wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. When he published the first Common Sense in Philadelphia in 1776, Paine addressed the crisis using simple fact, plain argument, and common sense. He mocked King George III and attacked every argument that favored loyalty to the king. He called the king a royal brute and a hardened, sullen-tempered pharaoh. You notice bringing in the pharaoh of ancient times who wouldn't let Moses and his people go, right? So we can compare ourselves to this biblical being. Moses is one, and the Jewish people fight for freedom against the Pharaoh and the Egyptians is like a David and Goliath story, right? And we as Americans, and again, this is where we get this idea from. As Americans, we tend to favor the underdog, or what we deem to be underdog, and usually it's done. And how we side with the underdog, quote unquote. A good example is we look in the Middle East today, and our alliance with Israel. Israel is seen as this little country, these 6-7 million people versus these billions of Arabs who want to crush them and push them into the sea, right? But can we look at situations so black and white? Thomas Paine again used his early form of media to get the early Americans on board, using the common sense, right? This idea, it's only common sense, and when he did this to help galvanize not the people, not the delegates who would become the future leaders of our nation, such as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. No, you wanted to get the poor people, the farmers, on board with this idea of a new nation, and that was the goal of the common sense. Again, the significance of the Declaration of Independence. So that you see a shift from the colonies, going away from colonies and becoming states. So it's a big deal when you go from a colony to a state, because when you're a colony, you're ruled by somebody else. But when you can become a state, may it be like California, which is a state. The United States is a nation state, right? The Vatican is a city state. So you have these. So when we say state, it's not like a state or state in the sense of a province. We're talking about a state. We're talking about states in the sense of a nation state, but also the early colonies were becoming states. Now, will they form a nation? Will they become independent countries? This is what the early forefathers ended up debating. This idea of republicanism. Now, when we talk about republicanism, and when we say republicanism, we're not talking about the Republican Party. Republicanism is this idea where citizens tend to be anti-royal. They don't want to adhere to a king. Republicanism is this idea of a republican form of government, democracy. We will vote on who represents us. and the people we vote for will go and lead us, in this place we might call Congress or Parliament or this legislative body, right? And what type of legislative body would it be? Also, the early beginning parts of independence, you see a confederation of states, right? So these confederation of states has this idea of the Articles of Confederation. When we talk about a confederation of states, it's a league of independent states that are united for the purpose of achieving common goals. When the fall of the Soviet Union happened, before it became Russia broke off and you had all these independent states, it went from the Soviet Union to a confederation of states. Then you saw there's those former Soviet bloc satellite states that were part of the Soviet Union become free, like Georgia. Now, there's a state called Georgia, and there's a nation called Georgia, right? And so you see these Armenia becomes an independent nation. Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia become independent nations because they were They were the Baltic states that were part of the Soviet Union. The Articles of Confederation established a national form of government. Now, the Articles provided for a confederal form of government. So when we talk about confederal, it's where the central government has very few powers. The central government is not as strong as the state governments. And if you look in your book, and I'm looking in the 10th edition, but if you look in the 10th edition on page 33, it has a model of what the the country, the form of government looked like under the Articles of Confederation. You had states had the ultimate power. Then you had Congress being the central part of this sort of system, right? And then over to the left at the top box is the president of the Congress. So you didn't really have a president, you had a president of the Congress, kind of like a prime minister. But the thing was, the president of the Congress was appointed by Congress to preside over meetings. He had no real executive authority, right? So he can come in and say, meetings, we're going to start the meeting, and then he can fall asleep, and then 2 hours later somebody wakes him up and says, adjourn the meeting. He says, meeting adjourned. That was literally his only function. So then you have civil committees and civil officers appointed by Congress to manage general affairs under the direction of Congress. And then over to the right-hand side of this model is Committee of States, consists of one delegate from each state appointed by Congress. So Congress had a lot of power, right? And it's not the form of government we have today. And really the states have the ultimate power. So this idea of forming an army, it might not be the best idea, because states will say, Pennsylvania, which was a large state, will say, okay, we're going to send 10,000 troops to join the national army. Well, guess what? Pennsylvania doesn't send the 10,000 troops. Pennsylvania probably sends 200 troops. But we'll get around to that. But the state militia is well armed and ready to protect the borders of Pennsylvania. So this idea of of nationalism wasn't at the forefront of the early colonists, right? The early Americans, they were very proud of where they were from. I'm from Virginia. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm from New York. It wasn't, I'm from the United States of America, which we do see a lot of nationalist type of tendencies today. If you look back, even back to the rise of in the World War I and World War II, it was those were very nationalist based wars. Germany wanted to control, because the Germans, regardless if it was the Kaiser William or Hitler, they have this idea that Germany was in a place of basically they're the best. We're the best. Germany is the best. So when we move on with this Confederation of States, the Articles of Confederation was just a bad idea. Crisis in the new formed states. What ends up happening is states refuse to help. Like I said earlier, remember, Pennsylvania promises to send 10,000 troops and they don't. They only send 300, 200. They because the states had all the power, then it leads to a bit of disruption in how things are done. Then we have Shays' Rebellion. because some farmers were they were indebted in western Massachusetts. They got upset. It was led by a former Revolutionary War captain, Daniel Shea, along with approximately 2,000 armed farmers, seized county courthouses and disrupt debtors' trials. Shea and his men then launched an attack on the national government's arsenal in Springfield. Shea's rebellion continued to grow in intensity and lasted until the winter, when it was finally stopped by the Massachusetts Volunteer Army, which was paid by Boston merchants. So this tends to scare people into this idea because of Shea's rebellion. The the leaders of the early call of this new formed Confederation of States realized that they need a strong national government. So then they get together in Annapolis, Maryland, and they have a meeting. They propose extending national authority to issues of commerce, which this is very important because when we're talking about commerce, we're talking about business, money, and interstate commerce, businesses doing business. Also, having a strong central government, especially when it comes to issues of commerce, you need to have some kind of currency that everybody agrees to a single currency, because when you have a single currency, the value of that currency will be the same and when I say value, I'm not saying that cost of living is going to be different, but that dollar itself will, what we call a dollar, will be of value. So after they come together in Annapolis, what they are first kind of reluctant to this idea of a strong central government, but people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison favored a strong central government. And James Madison's pretty. I mean, I know everybody talks about Hamilton, the witch god, but James Madison is very important to early America. He pretty much writes, and very intelligent man, but pretty much writes the Constitution. He's the guy that does most of the writing of what we call our Constitution. The Constitutional Convention, agreement of delegates from the states for the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. What ends up happening with the Articles? They kind of scrap it and just start writing a new Constitution that establishes a federal form of government. So this is where we get to drafting and ratifying the Constitution. When we talk about our delegates, people like George Washington consisted of people from the best educated and wealthiest classes. So, really these guys were, I tend to argue that the early forefathers wanted to, reason why they wanted independence wasn't just about taxes. It's also, you got to understand the wealthiest classes in the colonies were middle class back in England, because England has an aristocracy form of government, which basically means no matter how much money you have, it's based on if you were born into the royal family and so on and so forth. These were the elite. So these were the one percenters. They came up with this idea of the Virginia Plan. James Madison had spent months reviewing European political theory before he went to the Philadelphia Convention. This idea of the Virginia Plan proposed an entirely new national government under a constitution. But the thing is with the Virginia Plan, it favored large states. Now, under the Virginia Plan, you had a bicameral, that means two chamber. The lower chamber was to be chosen by the people. Smaller upper chamber was to be chosen by the elected members of the lower chamber. The number of representatives would be proportioned to each state's population. That's where the problem came in. Also, a part of the Virginia Plan was the national executive branch elected by the legislator, a national court system created by the legislature. So you still have the kind of like the strong legislative body. But the small states, so large states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia love this. Massachusetts, they love this. This worked to their benefit. But so when we talk about drafting and ratifying the Constitution, then the smaller states had a New Jersey plan, and in the New Jersey plan, Congress would be able to regulate trade and impose taxes. Each state would only have one vote. Acts of Congress would be supreme law of the land. Executive office of more than one person would be elected by Congress, and the executive office would appoint a national Supreme Court. Now, most of the delegates were unwilling to consider the New Jersey plan. Uh, so then this idea of the Virginia plan was brought back up. However, delegates from smaller states threatened to leave. So the convention was in danger of dissolving. So you had this Roger Sherman's plan, and he was from Connecticut. And they kind of call this the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. A lower chamber of the House of Representatives in which the number of representatives from each state would be determined by the number of people in the state. So this kind of benefits the large states, but then you have an upper chamber, the Senate, which would have 2 members from each state, and the members would be elected by the state legislature. There were some other compromises in the Great Compromise. You also have the 3/5 compromise reached during the Constitutional Convention. When we talk about 3/5, a second compromise had to do with how many representatives each state would have in the House of Representatives. Although slavery was legal in parts of the North, most slaves and slave owners lived in the South. So the Southern states, slaves consisted of 40% of the population. Counting the slaves as part of the population would thus greatly increase the numbers of Southern representatives in the House. The delegates from the Southern states wanted the slaves to be counted as a person, but didn't have the rights of a person. But the delegates from the Northern states disagreed. So eventually, a 3/5 compromise settled the deadlock. Each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person in determining representation in Congress. So that's where that comes up. The slave importation also. The 3/5 didn't satisfy everybody. So many delegates wanted slavery to be banned completely in the United States. So then they came up with this idea that Congress could prohibit the importation of slaves in the country beginning 1808. So no more importing of slaves. So pretty much, this is where breeding slave, having slave men breed more children, because after a certain time you couldn't bring any more in. So this is where chattel slavery is different than the Irish came over here and were treated differently than other white Europeans. Well, understand, within a generation, these Irishmen could integrate into the greater population, because why? Their accent disappears. They can change their last name. When it came to enslaved Africans, once they came to America and they were enslaved, their kids were enslaved. So it went from generation to generation to generation. Then there was banning export taxes, and this had to do with the South. Economic health depended on a large part of exports of agricultural products. The South feared that the northern majority in Congress might pass taxes on export. This fear was to let another compromise. And this is where you get Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce. That means commerce between countries, as well as commerce with other states. So you have interstate commerce with state, Virginia to Pennsylvania, but also countries, the United States and France, and so on and so forth. Then they had to define what the executive and the judiciary branch look like. This is why our Congress is the first branch of government. Congress is the first branch of government. So this is where you get the federalism. Now, when we talk about federalism is a system of shared sovereignty between 2 levels of government occupying the same demographic region: California, Sacramento, and Washington. LA, the City Council of Los Angeles, the County of Los Angeles, the the government of the state of California, and the federal government of Washington. This is what we call separation of powers. Okay, so everybody has a certain amount of powers. This is a true federal system. Powers of national and subnational units are specified and limited. So the federal government can't do everything people think they can do. U.S. federalism in practice is the national government has specific powers granted by the Constitution. The Constitution is the final authority of law in our system, possesses implied powers to accomplish its expressly designated powers. All other powers are reserved to the states. And then so on and so forth. Then it's distributed to our county and our cities. Alternatives to a federalism is the unitary system, centralized governmental system. We have a strong central government. We do, but other countries have even stronger. If you look at China has a strong central government. That's literally what communism is. Beijing controls everything. And of course, they put people in charge of their different provinces and so on and so forth. But nothing gets done unless it goes through Beijing first. Local government exercise powers given to them by the central government. National government can take away delegated powers at will. See, in our system, you can't just Washington just can't take over for Sacramento. It just doesn't work like that. Confederal system, League of Independent Sovereign States. I kind of talked about what happened to the Soviet Union after it dissolved. You had a League of Confederate States. Joined together by a central government that has limited powers over them. So the states that belong to the Confederation tend to have more power than the local government. Advantages of federalism to the United States. This right here, this model is just like you have one federal government. You have 51 state governments, including the District of Columbia. You have 3,031 counties. You have 19,522 municipalities, and so on and so forth. Then you have townships. So not every city is not every place is a city, but it could be just a township. You have special districts, water, sewer, and so on. And then you have school districts. We have a lot of school districts. We have almost 13,000 in our country. Reason why federalism is good because of the size of our nation. We have a pretty large nation. It enables experimentation of innovative policies and programs at state level, county level, and also city level. You can start a initiative, a new policy, let's just say out in San Bernardino County, and see how well it works there. And if it works well there, then we'll do it on a state level, and maybe even on a national level. Allows political and cultural interest of regional groups to be reflected in the laws governing them. Drawbacks. Now, with federalism, there are some drawbacks. You can have a single political group can dominate a small political unit, may not be concerned with the welfare of its citizens. State and local interests can impede national plans. You can have lack of uniformity of laws, state laws, complicates interstate businesses because laws are different in California than they are in Arizona. So you have to be aware of what those laws are. Difficulty in coordinating government policies at the central, state, and local levels, and there can be, especially when you have two political parties that don't get along, right? Or a president who doesn't get along with the governor, and so on and so forth. And remember what I said: just because the president is the president doesn't mean he can do whatever he wants. When it comes to taxes in our country, the taxes are collected at the state level, and then it's turned over to Washington. So if you have a president who's making threats about not giving funds to the state, the governor of the state might say, well, I won't collect taxes. So there you go. And if you don't have infrastructure to do it, see, the federal government doesn't have infrastructure to collect the state taxes. The states literally have the infrastructure. And again, when we talk about infrastructure, it's like United States Postal Service versus United States Parcel Service. UPS does not necessarily go everywhere, but the United States Postal Service does. And if it doesn't, it will literally hire somebody to go do it. So they might outsource it and source the postal work to an independent contractor who will come down a mountain, pick up the mail, and take it up and deliver it to all the people in their community. And so this is the conclusion of chapters 2 and 3 on federalism and the Constitution. I want to wish you well, and I look forward to some more of these. Now, that's this week will be 2 and 3. Just make sure you're keeping up in Canvas, because just because we're doing 2 chapters doesn't mean we're doing 2 chapters worth of work. Okay, so just be mindful of that. And thank you. Thank you very much. Have a great day.